Hi there. This is Erica Merrill, and I am the founder of Perfect Legal Video. And as always, we are spending a cozy afternoon here. Well, it's cold where Joe and I are, but we are here with attorney Joseph Nivin out of New York City. He handles family law cases. Welcome, Joe. Thanks so much for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
Today, we are going to be talking about a topic that may interest some of you that are going through a divorce right now, as a way to possibly save some money and, have an uncontested divorce, which is, I guess, a lot less stressful, I hope.
Yes.
So I guess that'll be the first question. Why would somebody go through mediation in the first place?
Because if it works, then it saves a lot of time, it saves a lot of money, it saves a lot of stress. So in terms of the time, the way that I've heard contested divorces being described is it's like being in a taxi cab where you don't know where you're going, but the meter is still running. So when you start the contested process, it's very, very unpredictable. It's very common to go to court, talk to the judge, have nothing happen, and then all you leave with is an adjourned date and a bill. With mediation, it tends to be a lot more efficient because you can go to a session and possibly resolve a very significant aspect of your divorce. Also, it saves a lot of money because, first of all, there's the most obvious that mediators generally charge the same hourly rates as lawyers. However, both parties are splitting the cost. So if you're going through a contested divorce, then you each have attorneys that charge anywhere from $300 on the low end to $750 on the high end per hour. But if you go to mediation, then you're both paying one person. When it comes to the stress, in a contested divorce, you're fighting and asking for the judge to make a decision for you over the other side's objection. But with mediation, what that does, it allows the parties, the couple, to make that decision as a unit about how it is that they will separate, who's going to get custody, whether they'll share custody, child support, equitable distribution, rather than fighting about and expecting a stranger to make that decision for you.
Well, what are some of the reasons that someone would go to court then if this is such a fantastic option?
Because they can't come to an agreement, or because they don't want to deal with the other person to try to get an agreement. The purpose of litigation is to try to get a court order over the other side's objection. With mediation, you're sitting with the person that's about to be your ex and trying to come up with a solution together. Litigation only really is an option when when mediation is not an option at all. There are some cases where mediation is really not an option, like if there's severe domestic violence, then we wouldn't expect a victim to sit in a room and try to come up with an agreement together with the batterer. If there's parental alienation, then you'll probably need the intervention of a judge. If there's abuse or neglect, then a judge will probably have to intervene. But short of that, I would certainly encourage people to try to use mediation.
So, I know we have some other questions. I just wanted to ask you though, with mediation, I know that there are people that go into mediation with their own attorney. Mm-hmm. Have you seen a lot of that?
I have, but I think that the better way would be for the parties to go in without their attorneys. This way they can speak more freely and then consult with their attorneys during the process.
I see. So what if somebody starts with mediation and they come upon, they agree on most things, but then they find out information that they didn't know before and it's just something they don't agree with? Is it possible to stop going down mediation and go back to court, or
yes.
How does that typically work?
Yes, but I think that what's typically a better option would be just to go to the next mediation session and say, I discovered this information, and given that I learned about this, I don't think that what we were talking about before is a feasible option. That's uncomfortable, but I think in the long term it would be more beneficial to do that.
So if you do get through your mediation and everything works well, who typically would draft an agreement for you?
Yeah. Well, almost all mediators know what are called drafting attorneys. So the best practice, even though there's really no set way to do it, would be for the parties to go to what are called review attorneys, to take what's called the memorandum of understanding, which is drafted by the mediator, bring it to the review attorney, get the attorney's view on it. Most review attorneys will say that it's reasonable. If not, you can always go back to mediation, so long as you agree with your review attorney. And then once the parties have gone to their review attorneys, then it's sent to a drafting attorney that's usually recommended by the mediator to present to the court.
I see. So they can kind of farm that out. Now, and of course, we mentioned earlier that, both people will split the cost of the mediation, but, sometimes one party will take it over the other. Is that correct?
You mean that one party will pay the mediator rather than the other?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if they decide that.
Yes, people are free to make their own arrangements as to how the mediator will get paid. But I gotta say, even then it would save money, because in those cases, then I know it might be tempting for what's called the moneyed spouse, the person that is presumably paying the mediator. Well, let me take a step back. I am making an assumption that the reason why one person is paying the mediator is because that person makes a lot more money than the other. But if that's the case, then the moneyed spouse would still be saving a lot of money by paying for the mediator, because if they went to court, then the moneyed spouse would almost definitely be paying also for the attorney for the non-moneyed spouse.
Yes, I see that. Now, I have heard from people before that they've gone through mediation and, they've gone through their divorce. Their mediation didn't work, and they ended up spending a lot of time and money trying to, I guess, compromise on things that they really didn't believe in for the sake of mediation. And, some of the people I've heard have finished their whole divorce through mediation, and then they felt like that later. And some of them have started mediation and just stopped in the middle because there was something they absolutely didn't agree on and needed someone else to make a decision on, like a judge. And, I don't know how much of that you've heard. I'm not trying to put it on mediation. It's just what I've heard out there.
Yeah. Well, you've really touched upon a few things. First of all, there are some people, yes, that go through mediation and then have regrets about the agreement. But at the same time, it's really impossible to know what would have happened had they gone to court. Now, I guess one weakness of mediation is that anyone can hang up a shingle and call themselves a mediator. So, obviously it is important to check out the person that you are going to, because anyone can do it and you don't really know what their training is. I think...
Anyone? Yeah. They're not an attorney, is what you're saying?
Right. No, there are plenty of mediators that are not attorneys that know every bit as much as divorce attorneys. Like, there are social workers, there are psychologists that do it, that certainly know the law, but there is that danger. And I have also heard, I heard a story about somebody who went to a mediator, submitted their records, gave a $15,000 retainer, and then were told, you've already spent it on your retainer on me reviewing these records. So obviously that's the con artist. So it is important to check them out, because it's not like you go to a lawyer and you know that it's either somebody who is a lawyer or is not afraid of going to prison, because it is a crime to practice law without a license, but it's not a crime to practice mediation without a license, because there is no license. I really don't think that in most cases it's a waste, even if it fails. I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but there was actually a study done out in San Francisco, because in San Francisco, you actually have to go to one mediation session before you start a custody trial. And custody trials are a lot more rare in San Francisco than there are in New York, and I would find it hard to believe that the fact that people have to go through at least one mediation session before doing a trial is not one of the reasons for it. So I do think that at the very least, it does start the process of negotiation. Now, if you need a judge to push you in the direction of coming up with a settlement, then that's certainly not too surprising in some cases. But at the same time, I think that mediation does force people to at least start the negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, because then at least they know they can agree on maybe points A, B, and C, but they still need to work on a couple other points. So it's possible that it still saves them money in the long time, because in the long run, because they they have fewer things to argue about when they get into court. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and they also started negotiating some of the other stuff that they might need a little push on.
I see. Now, do people ever worry that the mediator is taking one side or the other? I'm just curious of your.
I'm sure they do, but part of the mediator's job is to be neutral, and I think that mediators do need to be mindful that people do look for hints of bias, and that it's really on them to do their utmost to avoid giving people that perception.
Well, I'll say one thing that's very interesting that I heard, and I'm always throwing in. I know a lot of divorced people. I love talking to you. I heard that somebody started off with mediation, and the mediator actually wrote up what would have been a pretty, fair settlement. They used the state calculation for the, the child support. The alimony wasn't really touched because that's at the discretion of the court. Because one spouse made a lot more money than the other one, more than the cap, and then they stopped mediation. And then the next offer that the spouse got after from the moneyed spouse was that of like a quarter or a half of the state calculation. I mean, they can offer whatever they want, but it was interesting for those people because they just saw that the mediator had the most fair solution that they just naturally put together. And then they saw what happened after mediation was over and how things would have gone, and did go.
Right. I mean, I think that is fairly typical, that people see what's objectively the best solution, but then somehow they think that they could do better if they went to court and let a judge decide. A lot of people really underestimate just how grueling it is to get to the point of the judge making a decision over the party's objections.
Right. I mean, the judge is probably going to look at what the calculations are too, and it almost wastes a lot more time and energy and emotional, baggage that people are trying to go through. But that is something common. Then you're saying that most people will try to get a better deal after mediation, and then.
Well, I wouldn't say most. I think that I'm sure that most people think about it, but I'd like to think that most people would go to lawyers who'd explain to them everything that going to court involves. I think a lot of people believe that it's like Judge Judy, where you go in one time and then within the half-hour segment you get a decision. But it's not like that at all. It could take years and tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, discovery, motions, and mediation is certainly the easier, softer way whenever it's possible.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I've heard of personal friends of mine that have gone through $150,000, $200,000, and that's especially if they decide to argue about things like child custody.
Right. No, a custody case, if it goes to trial, will almost definitely cost at least $100,000 between the attorney's fees, the attorney for the children, and the forensic evaluation.
Wow. So that's all very interesting. So mediation, like now that we've looked at like the time that it takes is not what is on TV, and that is absolutely true. And then, just knowing that certain arguments are most likely going to cost a certain amount of money. And so that's something to really consider. You might hate your ex at the moment, but you're both going to save a lot of money if you can come to terms on certain issues that could cost you tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars later. What besides the child's custody would be a high cost decision to bring to court?
Well, custody is commonly what really drives up the cost. Child support and maintenance can be very expensive, especially if income is in dispute, or if the people make a lot of money, which would make the cap an issue. And equitable distribution also, if there are really a lot of assets, like if you're arguing over things like businesses, then that could cost a lot of money, because you'll also be paying for what's called evaluation. You may have to pay for a forensic accountant, and those are all very expensive. Depositions are very expensive, but for middle-class families, typically it's the custody that really drives it up.
So the number one is typically custody, but there are definitely several other issues that cost a lot of time and money in court. And that's why we're talking about this today, because mediation can really save you you might be arguing over the same amount of money you'd end up spending in court arguing over that particular issue.
Right. Oh, mediation is typically much less expensive than litigation.
So, I mean, I think that's fantastic. And when you have somebody like yourself as an attorney who, I mean, I know that you probably agree with me. Some attorneys are just out there to fight, and, you know, they like to drive up their bill. But, you know, really, you're very reasonable. And every time we talk to you, it's always about, you know, let's be reasonable. Let's make the best decision for the kids, first of all, if kids are involved. And secondly, let's look at what you're arguing about and what it might cost you to argue about this versus, you know, let's just be reasonable and come up with something equitable for both parties.
Yeah, I've come to be a very big believer in karma. And I think that it's easy for a lot of people to look at the con artists and how much money they make and figure that that's the way to go. But I am a very firm believer that what you put out in the world will actually come back to you. This applies to litigants and also attorneys.
And so you will counsel your clients on this karma factor.
Yes, I've done it from both sides. I've had people walk in and say, well, I'll just stop working so that this way the other side doesn't get anything from me. And I've counseled them about karma. And then I've also had people walk in and say, well, he knows how to hide his income, and he knows how to manipulate the kids. And I also counsel people who are in that position about karma and explain that almost every time the truth has prevailed.
I mean, I think that that's a really good point. I mean, people think that they can get away with something, and even if they do, it definitely comes back to them later. And sometimes they end up back in court later when the truth comes to light. Have you seen that a lot?
Yeah. I remember I represented somebody who was a very, very nice woman, and the father was not the nicest person. We ended up coming up with a settlement where he probably got a little bit more than he deserved, but then he must have forgotten that I was the one that represented the mother, because I ended up getting a message on a website where he was asking what he could do because the kid was refusing to see him. And of course I told him I represented the mother. I'm sorry, I can't help you. But that just went to show that eventually the way that he was as a person did come back to bite him.
Can it, like, what happened? Like, I know we're not talking about that, but like, so he got the custody, and then the kid decided he didn't want to see him, and
they did shared custody. And then the kid ultimately decided that he didn't want to see him. It depends upon the age of the child. I mean, I've had people sit in my office and say, well, I know the father wants visitation, but what happens if my 5-year-old doesn't want to see him? Then I, of course, tell them I'm pretty sure that you know how to get your 5-year-old to do things that he doesn't want to do. But if it's a 14-year-old, then the court will try certain therapeutic interventions. But if that doesn't work, then they'll usually just issue whatever order they think that the child will realistically go along with.
Right. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I've definitely heard of the situation where they're trying to do the drop off and the kids running away and just doesn't want to go there.
Right.
But and it's hard to force somebody to do that. It's just a miserable time then. So yeah, again, that's a great example of the karma coming back to you.
Yeah.
We really appreciate that. Do you have any stories about mediation and I know you've got a lot of interesting cases and things examples that you can talk about.
Hmm. Yeah. You know what? Mediation doesn't usually create all the good stories.
Well, then that's good. That means you should do it. I mean, I guess the story is that, people didn't have to court for years and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right. Right.
Do you have any statistics on how much less time it takes and how much less money on average? I mean, I don't know. I know it's so different.
Well, I've never heard of anybody spending six figures on mediation, I gotta say. But there have been plenty of times that people have spent six figures on litigation. I've never heard of anybody filing for bankruptcy because of mediation. But it's fairly common for people to file for bankruptcy as a direct result of their divorces, of litigation.
Wow, that's a really good point that you're making. So, to everybody out there, I guess this is a really great way to save money and not have to worry about, everything else that you might, you need to worry about later on if you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. So let that be a lesson to you. And, I think this has been a really fantastic and informative interview today. We really appreciate your taking the time and the effort